Hi everyone and welcome to our series where we interview computer science faculty to learn about their job search interview experience to basically help future faculty candidates better prepare for their job search. And today we are here with Andrew Quinn, who has recently joined UC Santa Cruz as an assistant professor. His research is on techniques and systems that improve software reliability. And with that, welcome and thank you for joining for this gap interview, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah, perhaps we can start first by you introducing yourself and your career path.
Sure. Like Manuel said, I'm Andrew Quinn. I just started here at UC Santa Cruz. My start date was, I think, July 1st. So I've been here, it's October now. So I think that's 4 months or something. Before that, I was at the University of Michigan. I started at University of Michigan in 2015, in the fall of 2015. So there for about 6 years. And then before that, I had worked for just a little bit over a year at a satellite office of IBM's, and then I did my undergrad before that. So at a really small school in the middle of nowhere in Ohio. So I think, I'd always, like, as soon as I started grad school, I thought, oh, I want to go do this professor thing. So in some ways, this is kind of, the dream I worked towards for 6 years plus, I guess, being here. So it's been really exciting to see it all kind of come to fruition.
Oh, okay. That's quite early.
Yeah. I mean, I went back, right? I was working and then decided, okay, I'm going to go back to school. And at the time, I mean, it wasn't like, oh, I have to go be a professor, right? But that was a big motivation for me, definitely going back to get a PhD, was that desire to go try to be an academic. So.
And what you thought at the time, how a professor position would look like? Did this actually reflect what you're doing now?
That's an interesting question. I'm, in some ways, I think I probably undervalued at the time the amount to which being a professor is about mentoring students, and especially mentoring grad students. I think I overvalued the amount to which it was just research, right? And then kind of weirdly enough, as I sort of saw more and understood more that, okay, the great professors that I really admire are the people who are working really hard with their students from a teaching and a mentorship role. That actually appealed to me even more than I thought my sort of original version of the job would have been in some ways. So my understanding definitely changed, but I think ultimately for the better. At least that's how I look back on it. Maybe that's revisionist history, but.
And what about your research direction? So we actually just discovered that we have some intersection there, right?
Yeah, so broadly, I'm looking at how we can make it easier. I guess the sort of one-line pitch is, how do we make it easier for developers to write efficient and correct software systems? So usually I'm doing that by going out and trying to build new tools or new systems, new techniques, maybe to understand what happens inside our software when it's running. And maybe we can better find anomalies, or, there's obviously, that's very broad. It's kind of intentionally broad. But that's kind of the big push. We could talk about individual research projects, but that's probably not worth listening to me just ramble on about my own individual small project interests. But
we can do that after the gap interview.
Yes, afterwards, certainly. Yeah.
And I mean, you mentioned that you started in July and you only defended in September. So first of all, congratulations on both defending at the position. And what are your thoughts on reconciling wrapping up the PhD and then also applying for positions at the same time? Or how did you approach this?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, ultimately, the kind of final chapter of my thesis wound up being, in some ways, I don't know if more ambitious than I thought or something like that. It took me longer to sort of build the system and test it than I expected. And at some point, I looked around with my family and we said, okay, I have to graduate, right? I can't be in grad school for another whole year. I think in the ideal world, right, you graduate and then all you have to worry about is the job market. And, you make this totally sequential. But for me, it just worked out where I thought that I just needed to be on the market earlier for us, basically, and for our lives. But reconciling that, like, was it difficult to balance those two things? Certainly, right? So, I mean, definitely, especially in the deep parts of say January or February, when the job market was really intense, it was very hard to get any research productivity, right? And so as a result, maybe if I hadn't been on the job market, maybe I would have graduated 6 months earlier. I don't know. That might be too aggressive, but something like that, right? 3-4 months earlier. And ultimately, it worked out. And I look back and I'm like, okay, I guess they made the right decision because it worked for me. But yeah, there were certainly challenges with that. That was definitely difficult to make it all work and balance kind of spinning plates and everything.
And were there also some synergies? So for example, when preparing the job talk, could you reuse, for example, parts of your defense presentation also?
Yeah, it actually kind of worked in the opposite direction for me personally, just because that was the order of events. But yeah, I mean, ultimately, my defense became, and it already was a lot, of course, about my thesis and my dissertation, or sorry, I said that in the wrong order. My job application and my defense kind of became very tied together, right? Very much kind of one idea, one push that I sort of resold multiple times over the course. In some ways, that means maybe I would have had an even better job talk if I had done the defense and all of that first, right? I would have been able to work out some of the kinks and understand better. But at the end of the day, certainly those two, there was definitely synergy there, right? Where the overall pitch of what I was, how I was presenting my research and my thesis is definitely much better having gone through the job market and that whole process of figuring out how to explain this work, especially to people who aren't just in our very narrow field.
Yeah, and I also noticed that you will be already teaching a class in the first semester, or you're already teaching a class.
I'm already
now?
teaching, yeah.
Yeah, so how did you basically approach this? Because you didn't have that much time, I assume, for preparing it and so on.
Yeah, that's, this was some advice I got from basically almost anyone I talked to who's sort of a recent junior professor. So a lot of people, when they're hired, I don't know if it's totally ubiquitous, but most people, it seems like, are hired with some amount of teaching relief for their first term, or for their first year rather. So UC Santa Cruz, we're on quarters or trimesters, whatever you want to call them. And so I get to take one of those quarters and I don't have to teach that quarter. So many people do that their first quarter. The advice I heard from junior professors was basically that just teach your first quarter. It's a great way to meet new students. It's a great way to get started with working with a bunch of master students and PhDs who maybe either don't have an advisor already or who might be interested in working with you along with their main advisor, right? So it's a good way to kind of get yourself into the mode and interactions with students. And I think it's panned out. I mean, I've really enjoyed it. I really enjoyed teaching. Now, it has been definitely difficult, right? Because it feels like there's a lot going on, and definitely it's been a lot of work sort of preparing for the course and everything. But I think finding something, in this case, I'm teaching advanced operating systems, which is definitely my research area. These are like my favorite topics to talk about with people. And so finding something that's really in your wheelhouse that you know pretty well and that you're really interested in, it makes it pretty easy to go do the work and get ready for any lectures that I'm doing or any discussions that we're having and that sort of thing.
Makes sense. And how does the teaching assignment at UC Santa Cruz work?
Yeah, I think some of this I still have to kind of figure out over time, but at least this first year, I was basically able to choose the classes that I taught this first year, and we'll see. I think in general, it seems like the more junior you are, the more they let you kind of choose, and then as you get more senior, you get kind of
right. Yeah.
You get stuck with what's open, I guess.
And will you also be teaching then likely the same class again in a year, or?
Yeah, that would be my plan. So I mean, I would like to basically continue teaching this class probably, every year forever, but every year until they stop letting me teach, grad level operating systems, basically. Yeah, I really enjoy it. I mean, I think it's incredible. I'm teaching it mostly as kind of a discussion-based course where we go read a paper, somebody presents on that paper, and then we have a long discussion about that paper. And it's been really incredible to see how engaged the grad students are and how, they come up with things that I just never would have come up with, right? So it's been really fun in that sense. I've had a great time.
Okay, sounds exciting. And did you also already get some students then that will work with you, or I guess that's developing since it's still the start of the semester, I guess.
Sort of developing, yeah. We'll see. I'm trying to work on. I have a number of collaborations back with my advisor from University of Michigan. So there's a number of projects I'm still working on there. But at UC Santa Cruz itself, I'm starting up some collaborations with people, or at least thinking about it, but nothing solidified yet.
And about the teaching load in general, so is it one undergraduate class, one graduate class per year, basically, in most cases, or?
Yeah, so because we're on trimesters.
Trimesters, yeah.
Right, so that remains a little bit to be seen. My understanding was typically you'll teach one grad, usually one upper level undergrad, so that's like junior, senior, and then one lower level undergrad. But there might be, we'll kind of see exactly how that works out. So maybe I'll let you know in a year or two what my experience has been. But that was like how it was framed to me when I first decided, to first had the offer and that sort of thing. So.
And in terms of service roles, are you already having any of these, or will this perhaps come like in the future?
Yeah, there's very. I am not currently doing any service, although I'm working on like joining a couple of committees, right? So I'd like to do something fairly low stakes. But yeah, I mean, there's basically no obligation at this point that this early in your career that you're doing a ton of service. I think it ramps up quickly, right? Next year, or I'll probably already be expected to be doing quite a bit more for the department. But the first year, at least, it seems like they let you go focus on research, focus on getting your group ready and understanding what research directions you want to pursue and all that sort of stuff. So
speaking of groups, so did you already start looking for graduate students?
I have had so far one grad student reach out to me. Well, I guess currently master's student reach out to me. So technically yes, but only just barely. Yeah, this is probably what I'll spend a lot of this fall, hopefully thinking hard about how do I entice students to come to, it shouldn't be hard, Santa Cruz is beautiful, but how do I entice students to come out here, right? Will be a big part of this fall.
One way, I guess, also to advertise yourself and your positions is being active on Twitter and having like a comprehensive website and so on. And yeah, so looking, for example, at your Twitter and your website, it doesn't seem you are too active on these platforms. So I just wondered, what is your perspective on being active on these platforms for your job search?
Yeah, I see. Well, so I think it's basically, so I've had a website, I don't know, forever. I don't know if it's always been that good. I just changed it because I was teaching, and I also moved it all off UMich's servers and stuff. So that just recently changed. But in terms of involvement on Twitter, I mean, it's certainly something I see, right? A lot of people in our community, and I don't know, maybe it's just not a skill I've developed yet. I would like to be more active on Twitter. How's that? I think it can be really beneficial, right? For publicity, for making past work publicized, and also for trying to attract students and be active. I think it's probably something I should be doing more of and working on. Is just not something I've ever done in the past, right? It wasn't something like when I joined grad school. I mean, people obviously were using Twitter to promote themselves then. It wasn't that long ago, 2015, but no one in my immediate circle was really, right? So, and I think you start to see that, right? When you first enter grad school and you only know 4 people, whether your advisor is on Twitter has probably a really outsized role on whether or not you're on Twitter. And at the time, my advisor wasn't really active in that world. So not blaming this on him, of course, right? But I think, yeah, it's probably a skill that I should be working on and taking advantage of these platforms.
It's perhaps a strange question, but it comes from me because I spend too much time on Twitter. So perhaps we should
we should find a medium.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say let's start chatting about the process, about the interviewing process, and specifically starting with the preparation phase. And my first question there is, like, what were your considerations when applying for institutions?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we started with like a list of, I mean, I don't even know how many. Maybe I went on CS rankings and I looked at the top like 100 universities in the world. It was something like that. Like, I mean, I started with a pretty broad pool. And I just went through, and my first pass was like, okay, are there people who I would like to collaborate with at this place? And I tried to do a little bit of a dive really to understand, you know, what are maybe, have I heard things about this place that are good or bad, or any of that sort of stuff, right? And I can't remember, maybe I, and then I guess the other pass right off the bat was like, okay, if, you know, for some of the things that were international, it would be a question of like, okay, do I want to move to this place? And that maybe got us, I don't know, let's say that brought it to 60 universities or something, I'm not sure. And then I sat down with my wife and we said, okay, well, I basically said, you have infinite veto power, right? Is there somewhere that you just can't possibly go? And yeah, I mean, there were a bunch of places that we both sort of decided like, okay, we can't see ourselves living there. You know, we just don't want to be in that town, whatever it might be. And that left us with, I think at the end, I wound up to applying to 20 something places. They weren't all, I also applied to some industry jobs. So I applied to Microsoft Research and VMware, and so maybe the total count, including all applications sent out, was 25 or 26, something like that.
And eventually were all these positions within the US or also outside, because you mentioned initially?
Yeah, also outside. So I wound up applying to a couple of places in Europe and a couple of places in Canada, and then in the US.
And because I mentioned you also applied for some positions in industry, do you think for people, based on chatting with different people, do you think it's always a decision that is, let's say, clear if you rather tend to continue working in academia as a professor then, or as a researcher, let's say in industry, or are people often undecided between these two options?
It's a good question. I would bet, you know, just my anecdotal knowledge and talking to random people, I would have to guess that many of the people who apply to academic positions also apply to like a small set of research labs. So I'm sure almost all of the architects who were on the market applied to like NVIDIA and Intel, and then also MSR and VMware probably. I mean, that's not 100%, but many of them do, right? And I think it is hard to tell what exactly you want to do. I mean, there's pros and cons to both of these places, or both of these sets of places. And ultimately I think the biggest difference is like, okay, do you want your main job to be mentoring grad students, or do you want your main job to be research output? And if you want your main job to be research output, then you should go to these industry positions. But if you want your job to be mentoring grad students, I think you'd be better served as a professor. It's not always easy. There is obviously some overlap, right? Some people in industry do have interns and things where they're working with grad students, and some professors obviously do have research output, right? So it's not cut and dry, but I think it's a decision that you might not be able to make well until you've applied. So I think the best advice I would give to somebody is like apply everywhere if you think there's a chance you would even be happy there, and let decide later once you know more, rather than trying to decide early. But what isn't going to work,
Yeah, sounds like good advice.
Yeah.
About application materials, so how long before the deadline did you start preparing them, like research statement, perhaps also job talk and so on?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, oh gosh, my timeline's a little bit messed up, but I kind of have this feeling that I didn't really start writing my research statement in earnest until like October, like maybe October 1st. I mean, I had been thinking about what I was going to write before then, but I don't think I really sat down to try writing it until around then. I know for certain that my job talk, I wasn't really preparing until after the new year. Like I'm 100% certain I didn't really start that until, I don't know, January 3rd or something like that. Because I think I can't remember exactly when my first interview was, but I think it was sometime in late in February or something like that. So that still gave me a lot of time to kind of plan. So that's kind of what I wound up doing. Your mileage may vary. Some people started much earlier than me. I know people who were in our shoes a year ago who started in like July, and I think they had like versions of their job talk in August. It's more a question, I think, of like what you want to prioritize and what you want to work on, and whether you'd rather have a job talk that you wrote a year ago and you're presenting, or whether you'd rather have a job talk that you wrote 2 months ago, I guess, in my case, or something like that.
Right, makes sense. And in terms of research statement, I'm curious, at the end, when you were giving the job talk, did your future vision still match the one that you described in the research statement?
Oh, no, they diverged quite a bit. I think this was something I didn't do a great job on. Was I don't think I did a phenomenal job articulating a vision in my research statement. I kind of had a number of things I was kicking around, and they weren't as sort of uniform maybe as they should have been. Yeah, that wasn't my best work, but the job talk version I think was pretty good. Like that worked pretty well. It just wasn't super good in the research statement at that point in time.
Okay, yeah.
So they differed quite a bit. No one seemed to give me any slack about them having differing. Like no one even mentioned that it was weird that they were different, right?
Right. And then about interviewing, so at UC Santa Cruz, did you have a screening interview or very directly invited for a full virtual or visit?
Yeah, so there was a screening interview here. I would say about half the places I went for the virtual visit, there was a screening interview beforehand, and about half there wasn't, something like that. It's not quite right, but it's close to that.
And what was the format of the screening interview?
So UC's was quite rigid, actually. They had like almost a set of questions that I think they're required to ask all of the candidates. And I don't remember, I mean, maybe there wasn't that many questions. Maybe it was 6 or something like that. But they almost always ask something like, and UC did too, introduce your research for a minute, whatever. Tell us why you think you'd be a good fit at the department. Maybe they'll ask you something about what your future goals are, something like that. Mm-hmm. So a version of that. Another way to ask that is, how will you know you're successful in 5 years or 10 years, or, what's your measure of success? That's a good way of asking what your goals are. They usually ask what you think you can teach. And there's usually kind of a 2-parter. What do you want to teach? So what do you feel totally prepared to teach? And then what do you think you could teach if you had to, right? They kind of want these 2 levels to sort of understand if they were really backed into a corner, what could they throw on you? Mm-hmm. That was maybe it. I can't remember. I mean, we wound up talking about other things, right? We wound up talking about each other's research more, just because if you put a group of 5 professors on the phone together, they're going to talk about research. But I think that was the structure of sort of the main questions or whatever. And that wasn't quite standard, but it was pretty standard across like those basic questions across all the screening interviews I was asked about, right?
And then for the full visit, how did that look like for UC Santa Cruz?
Yeah, so UC Santa Cruz was 1 day, and it was something like, there was one discussion before my job talk. Usually you meet with like a host. And so I met with a host before the job talk. And I remember if it was 30 minutes or an hour or something like that. And then I gave my job talk it was a hour and 5-minute slot or something like that. I can't remember, basically an hour. And then I had a bunch of interviews afterwards, and I don't even remember the number. It felt like 6 or 7. One of them was a grad student panel, but it was something like that.
And the first meeting with the host, do you still remember what you discussed and what in general, what kind of role the host has?
Again, I think that kind of varies some by school. So here, the host, we didn't talk that much about research. I think we must have only had a half an hour or something, because there just wasn't that much time to talk about research or things more like that. It was more like, she went over the structure of the interview. She asked if I had any questions or any constraints, right? Like, I mean, some people will be, normally they add this to your schedule earlier, but it can be as simple as me saying like, oh yeah, I have 2 dogs. We're all at home right now. Possible that they bark during the interview, just warning everybody, just like, okay, those types of very basic things. And they also, she was there to answer any questions I had, both about UC or about the interview process or sort of anything, right? So I could have asked, so more details about the process or anything like that. So that was kind of their role. ultimately, the other thing is, for probably true in person too, but for these Zoom meetings, she was kind of the person where like, okay, if my internet went out or if somebody didn't show up or something happened, right, that was the person I kind of bugged and went to. And so that was kind of their role. I don't think at UC Santa Cruz, but at some places I would later meet with the host again as sort of a more traditional one-on-one meeting. I don't think that happened here just because it was only a one-day visit.
And for the student panel, so that sounds a bit formal. Was it basically that also the students moderated the discussion? Was there some kind of moderator also, or you just had like some kind of unstructured chat?
Yeah, I think maybe calling it a student panel is an overstatement on my part. It really was a pretty informal, discussion between me and the grad students. They didn't necessarily, people had questions for me, definitely. But there wasn't like a moderator. They certainly weren't like formal questions. It was much more laid back. And it was a chance for me to ask grad students questions too about what they're working on, what they're interested in, what life is like here, right? I was able to ask some questions about, how do grad students feel at UC Santa Cruz? Or do you guys feel like everything to like, look, do you guys feel supported by the department, right? All these types of really basic questions that I think only a grad student can answer in a lot of cases. So definitely, if you have an option, and always ask to chat with grad students at anywhere you apply, without a doubt, because they'll kind of give you a pretty straightforward view of what it's like to be a student. And ultimately that's like a huge part of your success, but also like I wouldn't want to go work somewhere where grad students weren't happy, right? Or couldn't be happy and weren't supported. So.
Right. Yeah. Then about the one-on-one meetings, typically you talk about things like research and so on. But I was also wondering, did you also chat about, let's say, less career-related topics such as life in town or so?
Yeah. So people would usually we try to have some amount of time at the end to discuss life in the town and that sort of thing. That was something that was it was very important to me to try to get a sense as much as possible about these places, right? Especially being on a virtual visit. I'd never stepped foot in a lot of these towns. And so that was something that was really important for me and my wife to be able to kind of go look at least I can say like, okay, professors say this, then we can at least kind of have some sense of what's going on. And that was definitely something that was, that there was an opportunity for. You have to be, I think, a little bit careful. It's easy to wind up just like only talking about these types of things, because you're going to have so many questions, and you can fall into the trap where then you don't have a chance to talk about research enough with people because you're so caught up in like trying to understand where the closest, I don't know, whatever a coffee shop is or whatever the heck it is, right? So there's a little bit of a balance there, but it's worth asking something about the town, and most people will be, in my experience, most people are willing and want to at least have some discussion about whatever it is.
Right. Yeah. And did you also, during this one-on-ones, let anyone know that you have a wife, or was this
yeah, that was, so there's multiple, some people tell you like, don't ever say anything about having a partner until they give you an offer, and then you can tell them. And I don't know, I guess I just told everybody who if it mattered, it would come up, right? I wasn't like yelling to people, oh, I have a partner, this is really important, but if we were talking about something where, she came up. So that's just how I played it. Ultimately, a lot of times chairs you'll meet with a department chair, and a lot of times they'll say, oh, do you have any constraints or something like that? And I would usually say something like, yeah, my wife is she's not in academia, but she's going to have to get a job wherever we go. And ultimately, like, the decision won't be just about whether I like the school, it'll be about whether my family can move to the town. So I'd usually say some version of that just to set expectations about, like the importance of not just the school, but, my family moving 2,000 miles. But it wasn't, I don't know if that matters or not. I don't really have a sense of what the chairs thought about me saying that or not. And I have You can
Yeah,
do
that's
whatever you want to do if you have a partner. I think I've heard arguments in both directions that just basically pretend like you don't have a partner, because maybe that's seen as a challenge by the department. And I've seen the opposite argument as well. And I don't know.
yes,
No advice here.
Yeah, I also have been very open about this, and it seems to have worked out. So I guess it's fine.
Yeah, well, 2 for 2, at least on this random or this very not random sampling, but
Right, 100%. Okay. And did you also receive any unexpected questions during the one-on-ones, for example?
unexpected questions, not really. Sometimes people ask really big questions. I mean, I don't think I had perhaps enough, like somebody asked me a question that apparently you get all the time, but I was very surprised. It was like, who's your biggest role model in the community or something like that?
Mhm.
And I think people told me afterwards, like I only heard this from one person, and I had never thought about this before. So it was very difficult for me to on the spot come up with an answer that was reasonable. I don't even remember what I chose. But anyhow, but apparently that you get those all the time. I mean, do you mean like uncomfortable? Like apparently some people get uncomfortable questions, or they get, asked things that are, I have a friend who has a story of things that she was asked that were definitely inappropriate. Not,
now you have to tell it.
They weren't, I don't know. They weren't in good taste or something like that, right? But not to me. I don't know. Maybe there's probably a gender thing there that's playing in my favor, I'm sure.
Not sure. Do you feel comfortable telling this story, or?
Yeah. So, okay. So I'll tell this story. So, I guess the biggest event, I don't even know how to ask this question, how I would phrase this as a question, but I'll just tell the story anyway. So probably the biggest event that happened. So this was right in the middle, not in the middle, but towards the beginning of the job search. So I had written my applications, submitted them. I had a single phone interview, and I was working on my job talk, and just out of the blue, in fact, I was supposed to have a meeting with this person, just out of the blue, get an email that says, Peter Chen has been arrested, which was Peter Chen at the time was my advisor. This is like January 20th or something like that. So it's really, it was a really tough time for me, because this is somebody who, I looked up to, and really influenced the way I think about computer science. Right. I wrote my first paper was written with Pete and Jason Flynn, and it just really had a really profound impact on the way I write, the way I think, the types of problems I want to solve. So that was really hard. But the reason I bring this up isn't because, oh, look at how hard this was on Andrew. It's because what really happened is I accidentally learned that I think my best piece of advice for the interview process is have as much of a support structure as you can. Because what happened in my experience was immediately after this, my family, both my partner, but also my extended family and everybody, and all of my friends, both at the university and outside, and then other professors at the university, Baruch Kasici really stands out, but to be honest with you, like just almost all the professors at the university really gave me an unbelievable amount of support. And Baruch in particular went from, he wasn't even on my committee. He wound up chairing my committee for my defense. And, whereas I was getting whatever advice about a job talk, right? Immediately Baruch took on that role and gave me tons of advice about my job talk. And I gave multiple practice talks to him and his students. And, so my advice looking back is to say to anybody, right? Crazy things can happen that you just don't expect. And the best thing you can do is find and put as many people around you who are great and awesome, to give you resilience when they do. Because I think ultimately, if I hadn't had that support structure, there's no way I would have wound up where I am. Like it just would not have been possible. So anyhow, that's all I'll really say about it. There's a longer discussion to have about the challenges of losing your advisor in a very controversial way that we can have it another time. If you're interested, or if other people are interested, you can email me or whatever. But that's my advice as it comes to the job search, I guess.
Yeah, Sounds like a difficult situation. Another question, did you receive any diversity related question? And if yes, by whom were these typically asked? Such questions?
Yeah, diversity questions, it would depend wildly on the person. So I usually would get these in the screening interviews. That was really, really common. So that was one that I didn't include, but I'm almost certain that UC asked me about a diversity question. I don't know why I forgot about it. That was a bad job by me. They asked me at UC to change my job talk to include some discussion of how I plan to increase diversity in computer science. And so I had basically added a couple of slides to the talk to account for that. That's probably also why, if I remember, I remember them giving me a slightly longer time period than most places, probably was to account for additional discussion of this. In one-on-one meetings, my experience was that there just weren't that many. There'd be some, but not that many. And usually it would be if somebody was really passionate about diversity, equity, and inclusion, they maybe would ask you a question about, and especially if they read, so I had to write diversity statements for almost everywhere I applied. So if they read something that resonated with them, they might bring that up and they would talk about that. That was more my experience. I didn't have a lot of people kind of talk outside the confines of what was in my diversity statement.
I see. Yeah, I had a similar experience. And how did you handle breaks in between the interviews, specifically lunch and dinner breaks?
Yeah. So for the most part, everywhere I went would give me time for lunch at some point, varying amounts of time. Sometimes it was almost always half an hour to an hour. But the other thing that happens is you get on a roll with somebody and you want to just going for 15 minutes longer. I think somewhere at UC, I went like 10 to 15 minutes over. I distinctly remember, and they're half an hour interviews. So like that's like 1.5 times how long you were supposed to spend. And what I ultimately would do is I would always have lunch like just made ready for the next day. So the night before, I'd always make a lunch. That way it was easy for me to just have lunch. I could eat lunch in 5 minutes if I needed to. For me, I guess because I was interviewing from the US, and so your mileage may vary depending on where you are geographically. I almost never had a dinner break, just the way the schedule worked out. I almost always was just eating dinner after all the interviews, and that was fine. For lunch though, yeah, I would often have to have like a really quick meal or find a way to have a really quick meal. Don't be afraid at the beginning of any of these interviews, especially if you're on Zoom, to just ask your interviewer, hey, I need 5 minutes. I need to go get water. I need to run to the bathroom. I need to let my dogs outside. Whatever it is, they pretty much understand. Don't take like 10 minutes before every interview, because then you're like eating all of the time slots. But it's understandable, right, if you need a couple of minutes of break, and these things just kind of work out.
I guess it's also a good opportunity to have a look at some notes in between.
Sure. Yeah. Although in some ways it's almost easier, right, to have notes, because you could just have them and they're off camera, right? So sometimes it works really well. I mean, in some ways the Zoom thing kind of works well. No travel, and then I guess easier with notes and
right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And then about deciding, so how did you proceed when you received your first offer?
What do you mean, how did I proceed?
Like, for example, did you reach out to other institutions and basically ask if they could decide?
Yeah.
Or
so I did. I wound up reaching out to, I had some inside knowledge that it would be coming. Just the back channels, obviously nothing's certain until you have the piece of paper, but I'd heard from a friend that it was probably going to happen. And at that point, I did kind of reach out to other institutions and say, hey, here's this offer. And, there was a deadline on the offer, and sort of like, okay, this is the situation. I am going to take it by the deadline, if not, or whatever type of thing. So you just, be open with the places where you've interviewed and all of that. In terms of, I really wanted to do second visits everywhere that I could, at least in this case, I guess, first visits to go see the town. And so we did that. And that was kind of in terms of the school, I would reach out to, I guess that's another question, right? So I'd always reach out to the chair because I had a million questions, and I would usually reach out to whoever was usually my host, but not always my host, but whoever was somebody who I connected with in like a personal way, in some way where I could feel free to ask them questions that, especially if there were any questions that were a little bit, I don't know how you put it, like less of like, I'm not going to get the official answer. I kind of want to just know the real answer that somebody maybe wouldn't always tell you unless they were a little bit friendly or whatever. So I would almost always have those kind of multiple groups of people I was asking about and talking to.
And did also any of the faculty members reach out to you and like try to convince you to come and so on?
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah. So you'd see a lot, and they all kind of talk, right? So, like when you're considering, especially if you're considering multiple places or sort of thinking about another school, you'll get unsolicited emails that are like, here's why you should choose us over this other very specific school. So you'll see pretty, it definitely happens, and take that stuff with a grain of salt. Like in some ways they may have good points, in other ways they're obviously biased. So, take from it what you will. Yeah.
And how did you converge towards a decision?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I don't know. Everyone's decision-making approaches are different. I know a lot of people who do like huge pro-con lists. At the end of the day, we visited the places, figured out whether we thought they would work. I did more deep dives on collaborations and on people, and I tried to spend as much time as I could. To me, colleagues are probably we're one of the biggest factors for school. It's like, do I want to work with these people? Are we going to be able to do really cool stuff together? And that's how I wound up here, right? I was really impressed by the colleagues, and my wife and I visited and we're just blown away with the town and absolutely loved it. So that's how it worked for me. Use your own. Somehow everyone who winds up choosing a professor job, somehow they chose a place for grad school, right? I know it's a very different decision, but you've made big decisions in your life, and whatever your model is for using a big decision, whether it's buying a house or start where to go to grad school or where to go to undergrad, whatever, I'm sure you've slowly picked up what works for you. And this is just like all the rest of those, I guess.
Right. Makes sense. Before then accepting an offer, did you also negotiate?
A very little bit. There's some unclear constraints, right? So many of these public universities, right, they might not always be able to make any, or at least not big changes to, say, salary. Like they might have a couple thousand. They don't have like lots of money that they can increase your offer, right? I wound up negotiating like an extension of certain deadlines when it was possible. That was probably the biggest thing I did. And that was especially because I wanted to come for visits. So if I wanted to come for a visit, they were going to extend the deadline to at least accommodate that before I made a decision, right? Mm-hmm. And then in terms of, other negotiations, yeah, I mean, I've heard different things. Some people say you can negotiate a lot. Other people don't seem to think you can negotiate at all. It probably depends on the school.
And did you also talk with the school about your wife's job situation, or was this necessary?
Yeah, I did. Yeah, so I did. It wound up not being necessary in the sense that there's she's a school teacher. There's like a teacher shortage in California. So she has had like she has more job offers faster than I did. Like it was unbelievable how quickly she was able to find a place that she was happy with. So, the university did offer support, but didn't wind up needing it. I think that's pretty typical. Usually it's pretty informal. Well, okay, I should just speak for UC Santa Cruz. In UC Santa Cruz's case, it was pretty informal. It was something like the chair reaching out to the members of the department and just saying, hey, does anybody have a spouse in whatever this field is? Are you able to help, get a position for a new faculty member? And people were pretty, were very open about saying, here's how you look for this job, at least in my experience. So.
Okay, yeah, sounds great. Let's slowly wrap up. And as a first question there, are there any special kind of memories or experiences that stuck with you?
Yeah, that's interesting. So, one of the things, this is like advice not for job seekers, but advice for schools, I guess. One of the things I really appreciated at some schools would do just little attempts to try to make it feel a little bit like you were on campus. I mean, you weren't on campus ever, but like at some schools they would do like wine and cheese, or at other places maybe they would do like eat a meal together, right, at dinner time or something. And maybe they'd have a slideshow where people would talk very explicitly about, this is my favorite thing about the town and here's why. And anytime that happened, I always felt better about the place. And I don't know what you can take from that as like a job seeker. Maybe there's not much you can do to facilitate that. But it just sort of showed that little extra bit of like, okay, we're aware that this is on Zoom. We know this is like not perfect, but here's our attempt at trying to build some community here and invite you in some meaningful way, more than just through, you know, whatever, this box we're both sitting in front of. And I don't know, I'm assuming almost all interviews will still be remote this year. So I'm assuming the same thing will happen. But yeah, that was, so those types of memories really stand out as ways that we were able to connect, not just in like a, I don't know, a Zoom setting or pure Zoom setting. I don't know that I have anything else like in particular that really stands out. I do kind of remember it was a little nerve-wracking the first time I gave my job talk. I do definitely remember that. And one of the things I really remember about that is like the experience of giving a talk and not knowing if anyone's understanding what you're saying, because again, you're kind of on Zoom. That's a super nerve-wracking. I don't think there's anybody for which that's not nerve-wracking. I'd love to meet them if they're comfortable with that. You really feel like you're talking to the void. But I guess my advice there was, what I found that worked for me was pausing and trying to give people more opportunities to interact and give more, here's a great time for questions. Seriously, does anyone have questions? And like almost pulling them out of people because they almost don't want to otherwise, but maybe they feel bad if they feel awkward if you just kind of like pause for a minute. So that tended to work too, to try and entice people to make it feel less awkward than me standing in my bedroom at the time, giving those discussions. Yeah. So,
I can very much relate to that, because I also always felt very happy when someone was asking questions during the job talk, because I also felt more like, it just felt more lively and more interactive.
There also, the more times you give your job talk, those are the opportunities that something new happens, right? I always like it when something new happens. You get kind of bored of the same talk, and it also can be a springboard, right, for new ideas, right? So a lot of people would ask really interesting questions about coming to it from their own area, and some of like interesting ideas came out of that, those discussions. So anyhow, so find a way to solicit as many questions as you can, basically. I guess that's my advice. Yeah.
And I mean, you already told us what worked well from the institutional side, like what institutions can do to attract candidates. Do you have any other kind of feedback for institutions, what they could, for example, improve, or what other parts you appreciated?
I don't know. I mean, I think the big one I stated was probably the big one that I would say. Find a way to do something that gives a shared experience. That can be as simple as like buying the candidate dinner, having it delivered to their house, and sharing that dinner, whatever it might be. It can be, okay, we're all going to eat Chinese food, or we're all going to eat, I don't know, Indian, or whatever it is, right? It doesn't really matter. I think that's a really powerful binding experience in some way. Other advice, to be honest, the rest of it was fine. I mean, I think I would encourage people to be more, in some ways you need to be more active during the talks, ask more questions probably than you would in person. I think that's better, because it's gonna feel awkward to begin with, no matter what. So the more questions you can ask, the less awkward it's gonna be. So that's a big piece of advice I have. I don't know how you make people do that as an institution, but I think that would work really well.
And any advice that you can give for future faculty candidates, what they can do to improve their experience or their chances?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think there's a lot of things you can do that I didn't necessarily do a great job of. So I'll talk mostly about those. Maybe I can talk about the things I did well too, but I'll focus mostly on things I didn't do well. What were my learning experiences? I mean, one is publicize yourself like years in advance. So go out and give talks at other universities and other places, like when you're in your third year or your fourth year. And this helps you get visibility in the community. And a lot of places want to have you in for a seminar. They just don't even know to invite you. So that's one piece of advice I would have. That's something I didn't do at all, but many of my friends did. And, you know, I wish I had, right? I think that comes back to also like the Twitter thing we were talking about earlier, promoting yourself, being more involved from a publicity perspective is really important. And it's something that I'm still figuring out how to do, but I wish I were better at. I think that'd be helpful. And the other thing is like timing kind of matters. So I wound up in a position where I hadn't finished obviously my thesis, and that was fine, but I hadn't finished the third chapter. And if I had, I would have had more to talk about during the job talk. It would have kind of unified things in maybe a better way. And potentially it could have been, you know, it could have been like another part of my CV, right? If I had done that. But what really happened for me is I wound up targeting a project that was probably bigger than the amount of time I had before I was going to go on the job market, right? So sometimes as you're coming up to your last year or two, it's worthwhile to think about not just what you want to do, right? But what fits in the time constraints of what you want to do. Don't start an ambitious 3 or 4 year project that you know is going to take a really long time and be a ton of work. At year 4 of your PhD, you're never going to get that done in time, right? So finding a way to be smart about what you're targeting and really think ahead. Sometimes years in advance can be really huge, especially for, I mean, system students. I know probably not just system students listening to this, but in systems, a lot of times our projects are slow because we write a lot of code and it takes a lot of time. And if that's you, you have to plan even further ahead. So that's I guess my piece of advice is plan ahead.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah.
That's great advice. Yeah, so thank you very much for joining us today, Andrew, and all the best with your new position.
Yeah, thanks. I look forward to, like we said, I don't know if we said while we were interviewing or not, but I look forward to seeing people again in person. Can't wait for the next, whenever the first in-person like systems, you said Uppsala is in person or hybrid rather.
Hybrid, yes, yeah.
Yep. I can't wait for the first, like, you know, everyone's actually there and actually allowed to be there. And we, you know.
Same here. I missed the bad coffee.
Yeah, we can all have bad coffee. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks so much.